If you experienced a brain injury recently, you might develop depression because of it, or if you have depression, it might have been caused by a brain injury that you suffered beforehand. I know this sounds like a crazy link, but it actually makes a lot of sense. 50% of people who go through traumatic brain injury will develop depression afterwards. That's an incredibly high statistic for an illness that shouldn't actually be linked that closely. For ages, this has been very, very heavily debated because people are arguing obviously this could be an environmental thing. You'd have to go to hospital, you'd have to get all these things checked on your brain that would have been very uncomfortable and very scary. On top of this, you have to go through a traumatic brain injury, which I think would make anyone very sad and upset. And then obviously on top of that, in order to get up to the event of a traumatic brain injury, which is a pretty severe one, you'd need to be in a very, physically violent incident in order to reach that point of brain injury. And so obviously experiencing violent or dangerous things, experiencing all those hospital appointments, and then knowing that you've got a traumatic brain injury is very traumatizing emotionally. And so for a very long time, it's been argued that the people who just go down with depression after brain injury are just going down because of environmental factors. However, a whole new row of technology has come along recently that's enabled us to look at the brain in more depth, and just as neuroscientists predicted, it's probably actually linked to the injury itself. And the main backing source for this is that with normal depression, antidepressants can, for 50% people who take them, usually help ease the depression. But for people who were going down with the depression after traumatic brain injury, the antidepressants weren't actually as effective as they were in the general public. So this would suggest that the brain injury caused the depression potentially instead of environmental factors. On top of this, multiple of the clinical studies that they did on the patients who developed depression after brain injury showed that psychotherapy also wasn't working as effectively as it did in the general population. Now this is really interesting because a lot of people in the general population can also suffer depression from very traumatic and very violent incidents in their life that didn't affect their brain, maybe it affected something else, and they were recovering quicker from psychotherapy than people who had this specifically their brain affected. What doctors think might be happening here is damage to the neural pathways that are responsible for memory and also emotions, and because they're responsible for emotions, that would explain the increase in major depression in these patients. Because we're finally looking into this means that there are now ongoing trials and ongoing practices, and hopefully we can find better treatment for people who suffer from depression after having a brain injury. This could also mean that new rules get put in place so that people who go into hospital with brain injuries then do receive a follow-up for treatment for depression, because there is a 50% chance that they will develop it, and so we can put measurements in place to protect these people before they even start showing symptoms of the depression. This is really important to understand because despite the fact that 50% of people with traumatic brain injury will go down with depressive symptoms within the first year, after several years of the brain injury, 2/3 of the people who've had a traumatic brain injury will be showing symptoms of depression. So the side effects can come years after the injury itself.